Chloe, let's not kid ourselves here. Passengers want to feel safe when they see who's in charge, and a woman in that role? It's not exactly comforting, is it? Dave's words hit like a punch to the gut. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, like he'd just delivered some undeniable truth. Around the table, a few of the men exchanged glances, some amused, others indifferent. My chest burned, but I forced my hands to stay still, resting in my lap. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me react. My name is Chloe Rivers, and I've been a pilot for 25 years. I'm 43, divorced, and my life has revolved around the sky since I was a teenager. Flying has always been my escape, my freedom. But as a woman in aviation, freedom only gets you so far. No matter how many hours you log or how flawless your record is, people like Dave still look at you and see a liability. That day, when the promotion I'd poured my heart into went to someone who'd barely earned his wings, I knew something had to change. The first time I sat in a cockpit, my dad took me to see it. I was 9 years old, and he worked as a mechanic on small planes at the local airfield. "Chloe, you've got to see this," my dad said, his voice filled with pride as he opened the door to a shiny Cessna. I climbed into the pilot's seat, my hands trembling as they brushed over the controls. "Think you could fly one of these someday?" my dad asked, grinning as he leaned against the frame. "Are you kidding? I could fly it right now," I shot back, determined to sound confident even though I was awestruck. He laughed, ruffling my hair. "Big dreams, Chloe. Don't let anyone tell you they're too big." Those words stuck with me, especially when my mom tried to steer me toward something more practical. By the time I was 16, I'd saved every penny from babysitting and part-time jobs to pay for flying lessons. When I finally told my dad about my plan, he put down his coffee and looked at me, serious as ever. "So, you're really going to do this?" my dad asked. "Absolutely," I said, my heart pounding. "It won't be easy, Chloe," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They're going to make you work twice as hard because you're a girl. Are you ready for that?" "I'm ready," I said without hesitation. My dad nodded, the hint of a smile on his face. That was all the encouragement I needed. My mom wasn't as enthusiastic, but she didn't stop me either. "Just don't forget that flying isn't everything," she'd say, worried I was getting my hopes up too high. Years later, after the Air Force and decades of commercial flights, I thought I'd finally reached the point where I didn't have to prove myself anymore. So when the chief pilot position opened, I was sure it was mine. My record was spotless, my experience unmatched. But when Dave leaned back in his chair during the meeting and smirked, I should have known. "Passengers want to feel safe," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And a woman in charge? That's a tough sell." Those words hit me like a slap. My dad's voice echoed in my mind. "They're going to make you work twice as hard." I'd worked 10 times as hard, and it still wasn't enough. That meeting was the final blow, but it wasn't the first time I'd been overlooked. It had been happening my entire career. When I was in the Air Force, my commanding officer used to give me the toughest assignments, saying it was to prove I belonged. But no matter how flawless my execution was, the promotions always went to someone else. When I transitioned to commercial aviation, it didn't get any better. The comments were subtler but no less stinging, little reminders that I wasn't what passengers or colleagues expected in a pilot. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that every flight I commanded was a chance to prove them wrong. And for a while, that was enough. My dad was my biggest cheerleader, calling me after every milestone. "Another glass ceiling smashed, Chloe," he'd say, his pride almost palpable. But when I told him about being passed over for chief pilot, his voice dropped. "That's not right, Chloe. You've given them everything. What are they giving you back?" "Nothing, Dad," I said quietly. "They're giving me nothing." "Then maybe it's time to stop playing by their rules," my dad said. His words stuck with me. For the first time, I started wondering if he was right. Maybe I'd spent too many years fighting to prove myself in a system that would never let me win. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my flight logbook. Over 20,000 hours in the air, countless long-haul flights, weathering everything from technical failures to passengers in full-blown panic. All of it. And what did I have to show for it? A ceiling I couldn't break through, and a career they refused to take seriously just because I wasn't a man. I called my dad. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Chloe, what's up?" he asked, his voice calm and steady as always. "I'm done, Dad," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm quitting. I can't keep doing this. I've given them everything, and they just keep tossing me aside." There was a pause on the other end. Then he said, "Maybe it's about time. You've been playing their game for too long, Chloe. Maybe it's time to make your own rules." His words planted a seed. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. By the end of the week, I knew what I had to do. If they weren't going to make space for women in leadership, then I would. That's how the idea for a women-only flight school was born. It felt crazy at first, a long shot, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I didn't just want to leave the airline. I wanted to change the industry. The first step was figuring out where to start. I had savings, but not enough to get a flight school off the ground. Planes, a hangar, instructors, it all added up fast. My mom, ever the pragmatist, called me the day after I told her about my plan. "Chloe, are you sure about this? Starting a business isn't like taking off in one of those planes. You can't just hit autopilot," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "I know, Mom," I said, pacing my living room, "but I can't keep banging my head against a wall that's never going to break. If I don't do this, who will?" She sighed. "You've always been stubborn. Just promise me you'll have a backup plan." "I promise," I said, though I knew there was no backup plan. This was it. My next call was to Laura Delgado, my former flight instructor and one of the few people in aviation who'd always had my back. When I told her my idea, she didn't hesitate. "Chloe, this is brilliant," she said. "The industry needs this. Let me help." With Laura on board, I felt like I finally had some traction. We spent hours sketching out ideas, looking for locations, and brainstorming how to recruit students. It wasn't glamorous, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was working towards something that mattered. From the start, I knew the school wasn't just about teaching women to fly. It was about leveling the playing field. I wanted to create a place where women could not only learn the technical skills, but also build the confidence to face an industry that would try to knock them down at every turn. My goal wasn't just to train pilots. I wanted to train leaders. Over coffee one morning, Laura and I hashed out our mission statement. "It has to be more than just aviation," I said, jotting notes in the margins of my planner. "We need to teach them how to navigate the system, to push back when someone says they're not enough." Laura nodded. "Exactly. We can bring in guest speakers, women who've broken barriers in aviation, engineering, anything related. Show them it's possible." "And scholarships," I added, my mind racing. "We'll make it accessible for women who can't afford traditional training programs." Laura leaned back, smiling. "You're not just building a school, Chloe. You're building a movement." Hearing her say that lit a fire in me. This wasn't just a business. It was a chance to change the narrative for every woman who'd ever been told she didn't belong. The next few months were a blur of planning, phone calls, and rejection emails. Every time I pitched the idea to potential investors or banks, I was met with skepticism. "A women-only flight school?" one bank manager said, raising an eyebrow. "It's a niche market. I'm not sure there's enough demand to make it sustainable." I started to worry that the school would fail before it even began. Then Laura came through with a lead. "Chloe," she said one evening as we sifted through paperwork at my kitchen table, "have you heard of Wings of Change? They're a nonprofit that funds aviation initiatives with a focus on diversity. I shook my head, but the idea gave me hope. Laura helped me pull together a detailed proposal, outlining everything from our mission to the practical details like tuition, projected costs, and how the school could make a real impact. A week after submitting it, I got a call from the director of Wings of Change. "Chloe, I've read your proposal," she said, her voice steady and professional. "And I have to say, this is exactly the kind of project we want to support. We're prepared to offer you a startup grant to cover your first year." I nearly dropped the phone. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice cracking with disbelief. "Dead serious," she replied. "Your vision is exactly what this industry needs." With their support, we were finally able to lease planes, rent a small hangar, and officially launch the Women's Aviation Academy. When the Women's Aviation Academy officially opened, I was equal parts excited and terrified. Laura and I had done everything we could to spread the word, but until that first day, we had no idea if anyone would actually show up. As I stood in the hangar that morning, nervously rearranging the chairs we'd set up for orientation, I heard a car pull up. The first to walk in was Sarah, a young aircraft mechanic with grease-stained hands and wide, eager eyes. "I've always wanted to be a pilot," she said, shaking my hand. "But every time I mentioned it, someone would laugh and say, 'Stick to fixing the planes, not flying them.'" Then came Janet, a retired nurse in her mid-50s. She looked around the hangar with a mix of awe and apprehension. "Flying's been my dream since I was a kid," she said, her voice soft. "But life got in the way, family, work, everything. When I saw your program, I thought, maybe it's not too late." By mid-morning, 5 women were seated in the hangar, each with a unique story but all sharing the same determination. I stood in front of them, trying to keep my emotions in check as I welcomed them to the academy. "You don't just belong here," I told them. "You're the reason this place exists." For the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Months passed, and word about the academy started to spread. At first, it was slow, mostly through social media and local aviation clubs, but then one of our students posted a video of her first solo flight on Instagram, and things took off. More applications started coming in, and soon, our tiny classroom of 5 students grew into a bustling program with over 20 women enrolled. It wasn't long before Laura and I realized we couldn't handle everything ourselves. Between teaching classes, handling admin work, and keeping the planes in top shape, we were stretched too thin. "We need more instructors, Chloe," Laura said one evening as we went over the schedule. "We can't do this alone anymore." She was right. The next day we posted a job listing for flight instructors with a clear emphasis. We wanted people who believed in our mission. The responses were incredible. One applicant, Jasmine, was a former military pilot who had left the Air Force to start a family and wanted to return to aviation in a meaningful way. Another, Priya, was a commercial pilot who had grown disillusioned with the corporate side of flying and saw the academy as a chance to give back. By the end of the hiring process, we had a team of instructors who were just as passionate about the academy as we were. With their help, we could finally meet the growing demand while staying true to our vision. After a year of nonstop work, the academy was thriving. The airfield was no longer the quiet, run-down place we'd started with. It was alive with the buzz of engines, laughter, and the sound of women conquering the skies. But what really marked the turning point was the email I received one morning from a recruiter at Horizon Air, a mid-sized commercial airline. "Hi, Chloe," it read. "We've been hearing great things about the Women's Aviation Academy and wanted to know if you have any graduates ready for entry-level positions with us. We're looking for skilled pilots, and your program seems like the perfect place to start." I read the email twice, then called Laura. "Laura, you're not going to believe this. Horizon Air wants to recruit our students." She let out a cheer on the other end. "Chloe, this is it. This is what we've been working for. The industry is finally paying attention." Over the next few weeks, more inquiries trickled in. Small airlines, regional carriers, and even one from a major international airline asking about availability. Our students were in demand, and I couldn't have been prouder. The best part? Every time one of them landed a job, it felt like a victory not just for them, but for the mission we'd built together. Not long after the inquiries from airlines started rolling in, I got a phone call from a local high school. The principal introduced herself as Mrs. Turner and said, "Chloe, I've heard about what you're doing at the Women's Aviation Academy, and I think it's incredible. We're holding a career day next month, and I'd love for you to come speak to our students, especially the young women. I think they need to hear that this kind of career is possible." I hesitated for a moment. Speaking in front of a classroom full of teenagers wasn't exactly my comfort zone, but I knew how important it was to reach them. "Of course," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'd be happy to." The day of the lecture, I walked into the school gymnasium, which was packed with students buzzing with energy. Mrs. Turner introduced me as a trailblazer in aviation, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "When I was your age," I began, "I sat in a cockpit for the first time and knew I wanted to fly. But I also knew the world didn't always make it easy for girls like me to dream that big. That's why I'm here today, to tell you that no dream is too big and no goal is too far out of reach." The room grew quiet as I shared my journey, from my first flying lessons to starting the academy. When I opened the floor to questions, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "Do you think someone like me could be a pilot?" she asked, her voice uncertain. I smiled and said, "Not only do I think you can, I know you can. And when you're ready, you come find me at the academy, and we'll get you started." The look on her face made every challenge I'd faced along the way feel worth it. A few weeks after the lecture, I was at the academy, watching Lisa, one of our newer students, prepare for her first solo flight. Lisa was a single mom who had spent the last decade juggling work and raising her son. She told me once during a break between lessons that flying had always been her dream, but she'd never thought it was something she could actually pursue. "Life just gets in the way," she had said with a small, wistful smile. But here she was, strapping into the pilot's seat with the kind of determination that made me stop and watch. As she taxied down the runway, I held my breath. The moment her plane lifted off, a cheer went up from a small group of students watching from the edge of the hangar. I glanced at her son, who was standing next to me, his eyes wide with pride. "That's my mom," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. When Lisa landed and stepped out of the cockpit, she looked overwhelmed but radiant. Her son ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You're amazing, Mom," he said, beaming up at her. Lisa looked over at me, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, Chloe. You've changed my life." Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. For so many years, I had believed that success was measured by titles and promotions. But watching Lisa soar, both literally and figuratively, made me realize that true success was right here, in the lives I was helping to change. This was more than a career. It was a calling. A couple of years later, the Women's Aviation Academy was thriving in ways I could have only dreamed of. The old airfield that once felt empty and quiet was now a hub of activity. We had expanded to include 3 hangars, a fleet of 6 planes, and a steady stream of students from all walks of life. Some were young women fresh out of high school, eager to pursue a non-traditional path, while others were older, like Lisa, proving that it's never too late to chase a dream. Laura and I had even implemented new programs, scholarships for underrepresented women, partnerships with community colleges, and a mentorship initiative connecting students with experienced female pilots in the industry. Airlines were reaching out regularly, asking about our graduates, and our placement rate was climbing higher than we'd ever expected. One afternoon, while reviewing applications in my office, Laura walked in holding an envelope. "You're going to want to see this," she said, handing it to me with a grin. It was an invitation from the National Aviation Association, inviting me to speak at their annual industry gala as a keynote speaker. I stared at it for a moment, the weight of it sinking in. "They want me to talk?" I asked, half in disbelief. "They don't just want you to talk," Laura said. "They want you to share how you've reshaped the industry. Chloe, they're finally paying attention." As I read through the letter, I couldn't help but smile. The Academy wasn't just thriving, it was making waves, and the people who once dismissed me were now taking notice. The gala was held at a grand hotel ballroom downtown, with glittering chandeliers and a polished crowd of industry professionals. I arrived early, trying to take it all in. It felt surreal, walking into a room full of the same executives and decision-makers who had once ignored or dismissed me. But this time, I wasn't there as just another pilot. I was there as a keynote speaker, representing the Women's Aviation Academy and everything we'd built. Laura walked in beside me, beaming with pride. "You ready for this?" she asked, nudging my arm. "Ready as I'll ever be," I said, though my heart was racing. I scanned the crowd and saw familiar faces from my airline days, including Dave, standing near the back, his expression unreadable. Megan Carrington, who had always towed the company line, was nearby, chatting animatedly with a group of executives. The evening was moving along smoothly, with awards being handed out to trailblazers and innovators in aviation. I was seated at a table near the front with Laura and a few of our graduates who had come to support me. We were enjoying the speeches when one of the presenters took the stage and began talking about a special recognition award. This next award is given to someone who has not only excelled in aviation, but has also dedicated themselves to reshaping the future of our industry. This individual has created a path where none existed, empowering countless women to take to the skies. Tonight, we honor Chloe Rivers, founder of the Women's Aviation Academy, with the National Aviation Excellence Award. I froze, the words barely registering. Laura nudged me, her face glowing with pride. "Chloe, that's you. Get up there." As I made my way to the stage, the applause filled the room, but my heart was pounding for a different reason. Standing at the back of the crowd, arms crossed and visibly uncomfortable, was Dave. The man who had looked me in the eye years ago and told me passengers wouldn't feel safe with a woman in charge. He was here, and he was seeing this. I accepted the award with trembling hands and stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. I started the Women's Aviation Academy because I was tired of hearing the word no. "No, you're not what we're looking for. No, you don't fit the mold." Tonight, this award isn't just for me. It's for every woman who has ever heard no and decided to keep going anyway. The applause was deafening, but all I could see was Dave, his smirk replaced with an expression I couldn't quite read. For the first time, I felt the scales tip, and it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a vindication for everything I'd fought for. As the gala wound down and people began to filter out of the ballroom, I carried the award in my hands, still trying to process everything. The recognition, the applause, it felt like years of frustration and struggle had finally been validated. Laura had gone ahead to grab the car, leaving me to navigate the crowd alone. That's when I saw him, Dave. He was standing near the exit, a drink in his hand, and for a split second, I considered slipping out unnoticed. But then he looked up, and our eyes met. There was no turning back. "Chloe," he said, forcing a smile as I approached. "Quite the speech up there. Congratulations. On everything." "Thanks, Dave," I said, my tone calm but firm. "It's funny, isn't it? A few years ago, you didn't think a woman could handle the responsibility of leadership. And now, here I am." His smile faltered, and he looked away for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "It wasn't personal, you know," It was just the way things worked back then. The way things worked? I repeated, shaking my head. Dave, it was the way you worked. But the world's changing now, and so is this industry. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. I've chosen my side. What about you? He didn't have an answer. As I walked past him and out into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in years. The fight wasn't over, but tonight was proof that progress was possible, and I wasn't done making it happen. As I rode home that night, the award resting on my lap, I replayed the evening in my mind. The applause, the recognition, the look on Dave's face, it all felt surreal. But more than anything, it reinforced what I'd known for a while now. Starting the Women's Aviation Academy wasn't just the right decision, it was the best decision I'd ever made. When I got home, I placed the award on the mantel in my living room, right next to a framed photo of my dad. He had passed away 6 months ago, but his words still echoed in my mind. Don't let anyone tell you your dreams are too big. For years, I'd chased the approval of people who would never give it to me. But now, I wasn't chasing anyone. I was leading. As I sat on the couch, scrolling through messages from students, colleagues, and even strangers who had heard the news, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. The fight wasn't over, and there were still barriers to break, but tonight was a victory. Not just for me, but for every woman who dared to dream big in a world that told her to stay small. And as I looked at the mantel one last time before heading to bed, I smiled. The sky wasn't just a limit anymore. It was a canvas, and we were rewriting what it meant to belong up there.
Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
My name is Sandra, and I'm the mother of an 18-year-old college student named Michael. For years, my husband Brian and I have made countless sacrifices to support his education, giving up holidays and tightening our belts in every possible way to secure his future. We live in a cozy, modest home that once belonged to my grandmother before she moved to a nursing home. Brian works at a local hardware store, and I manage the front desk at a doctor's office. Our life is simple, but we're happy with it. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, and I was preparing dinner when Brian's phone rang. His worried "Hello, Mom, slow down, what's wrong?" made me pause. He began pacing, his face pale and tense. When he finally hung up, he sank onto the couch, looking defeated. "It's my parents," he said quietly. "Their business went under. They're bankrupt and lost everything, even their house." My heart sank. "Oh, Brian, that's terrible. What will they do?" He sighed, his worry evident. "They're asking if they can stay with us, just until they figure things out." I hesitated, thinking of our already tight budget and how settled our life was. "And what did you say?" "I told them I'd talk to you first," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is your house too, Sandra. I didn't want to decide without you." Brian's parents, Terry and Catherine, were far from easygoing. They were used to luxury, and I knew our simple home would be quite a shock for them. "You know how they are," I said gently. "This house, it's not exactly their style." "I know," Brian replied, looking torn. "But they're my parents, and they're really in a bind." I thought about it, remembering the times they'd visited and barely concealed their disdain for a modest setup. But knowing they were desperate enough to ask for help softened me. "All right, they can stay, but just temporarily, until they get back on their feet." Brian nodded gratefully and called his mother back. "Mom, Sandra and I talked it over. You can stay with us for a bit, but you'll need to start looking for your own place soon." I couldn't hear a response, but the firmness in Brian's voice. Eyes, Mom, were clear, said it all. The following week, they arrived. I stood on the porch, my stomach sinking as two massive moving trucks rolled up. Brian managed a forced smile, directing the movers. Terry was the first to greet him, slapping him on the back like he'd hit the jackpot. Catherine swept over to me, her perfume overwhelming as she kissed my cheek. "You're an angel for letting us stay," she said sweetly. I smiled, glancing nervously at the mountains of furniture and boxes now overflowing onto our front lawn. Is this all just the essentials? I muttered under my breath, trying to stay polite. Oh yes, Catherine replied airily. Just the basics, of course. Brian and I shared a worried glance as the movers began lugging in armchairs, boxes, and even a towering grandfather clock. It quickly became clear that the essentials were far from minimal. Every inch of our modest living room was being overtaken by their belongings, which seemed to multiply as each box was carried in. I pulled Brian aside as the movers took a break. This is too much, I whispered. They've brought enough to fill an entire house. Where are we supposed to put all of this? He rubbed his temples, looking weary. I know, Sandra. I'll talk to them. Let's just get through today. By the time everything was inside, our cozy home looked like a storage unit. Dinner felt cramped, with boxes stacked around us. Terry and Catherine seemed oblivious to the mess, laughing and chatting as Terry poured a glass of expensive wine. Sandra, you have to try this, he insisted, swirling the wine like we were at a high-end tasting. Brian cleared his throat, trying to set some boundaries. We'll need to go over some ground rules, he started gently. Space is tight and… Oh, don't worry about it, son. Terry cut him off, waving a hand dismissively. We'll make it work, won't we, Catherine? I forced a smile as they carried on, looking around at the piles of boxes and ornate decorations that had taken over our simple space. This was going to be a long stay. Life with Terry and Catherine was proving more challenging than I had imagined. A few days after they'd settled in, another strain surfaced. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was preparing a simple spaghetti dinner when Catherine strolled into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling in obvious distaste. What's that smell? She asked, her tone laced with disapproval. It's dinner, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. Spaghetti. Where's the meat? The fresh herbs, she scoffed, peering over my shoulder as if the simmering sauce was somehow offensive. Hearing her tone, Brian stepped in, drying his hands on a dish towel. What's wrong? The problem, Brian, is that we're expected to eat this. Catherine gestured toward the pot with disdain. Taking a steadying breath, I explained, this is what we usually have. We can't afford steaks and gourmet meals every night. Brian's expression hardened, and he turned to his mother, his voice firm. Mom, this is Sandra's home too. If you prefer something else, you're welcome to cook it yourself. Catherine's eyes narrowed as she retorted sharply, Oh, we will. And we expect you to provide the groceries we need. We're not used to living like this. I felt my patience fray. I understand that you're used to different standards, but this is what we can afford. Our budget doesn't cover luxuries. Terry, who had been quiet until now, interjected loudly, Then perhaps you should reconsider your budget. We're not animals to live off scraps. Brian's jaw clenched. Dad, that's enough. We're doing the best we can. Catherine huffed. Fine. Tomorrow, we'll give you a list of what we want to eat. Make sure it's here. The next day, true to her word, Catherine handed me a list filled with items like marbled beef, fresh seafood, and imported organic products. As I looked it over, my heart sank. That evening, we all sat down, the list sprawled out on the kitchen table. Terry declared, We expect proper meals, like steak or fresh fish. Brian and I exchanged a look of disbelief. We can't afford that, he said, his voice firm but weary. It's just not in our budget. Their response was swift and cutting. Lazy, both of you, Catherine snapped. Can't even provide a decent meal. Feeling cornered, I reluctantly gave in. I began purchasing only the finest ingredients for their meals, while Brian and I resorted to cheaper fast food to save costs. A month later, the strain in our finances and patience was beginning to show. After reviewing our expenses, I was stunned to see our food budget had doubled. Catherine's long, luxurious baths had sent the water bill soaring as well. Dinner had turned into a nightly battleground, but tonight felt like the breaking point. As Terry and Catherine enjoyed their plates of marbled steak and imported fish, Brian and I sat opposite them with simple pasta, the only meal we could afford. The difference on our plates was stark, highlighting an ever-deepening divide. Unable to hold back any longer, I finally spoke. This has to stop. We can't keep living like this, eating different meals. From now on, everyone in this house will eat the same food, and it'll be within our budget. Terry laughed dismissively, a grating sound that tested my patience. You expect us to eat that slop? It's not slop, it's dinner. What we eat, I shot back, my voice tinged with frustration. The laughter vanished from Terry's face, replaced by a scowl. Catherine's tone turned sharp. How can you be so greedy and lazy? Cooking a decent meal isn't that hard. Both of them looked at Brian expectantly, as if waiting for him to side with them. That was it for Brian. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the plates rattle. First off, this is Sandra's house as much as mine, and you will treat her with respect, he said, his voice resonant and firm. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. I never thought I'd see the day when you, my son, would shout at me like this. Terry's frustration boiled over as he jabbed his finger toward Brian. Look at you, completely whipped and following her every command. Is this really who you've become? I kept my composure, though my heart was pounding. Enough. This conversation is over. From now on, no more lavish spending on steaks or seafood. We all eat the same, simple meals. A frosty silence fell over the room as Terry and Catherine pushed their chairs back and left the table without another word. Brian and I remained, surrounded by the heavy quiet. He reached across the table, squeezing my hand. I'm sorry it came to this, he said softly. I nodded, feeling the weight of the evening settle on us. Me too, but it's the right choice. We can't keep living like this. After that night, the atmosphere at home grew quieter, but the tension simmered beneath the surface. Terry and Catherine's silence carried a hint of defiance, as though they were biding their time. A few days later, as I was cleaning up from a simple lunch of sandwiches, the doorbell rang. Expecting a delivery or perhaps a neighbor, I went to the door, only to be met by a delivery man holding a large, fragrant bag from an upscale local restaurant. Delivery for Sandra, he asked, glancing at his clipboard. I stared, confused. There must be a mistake. I didn't order this. Just then, Catherine appeared beside me with an overly bright smile. Oh, I decided to treat us to a nice meal. We deserve a little comfort after all the tension. I hesitated, holding the bag. Catherine, we discussed this. We're cutting back on expenses. She avoided my gaze, giving a dismissive shrug. Well, I thought a little treat wouldn't hurt. I thought it was on your tab, dear. My mistake, Catherine said lightly. Brian entered from the kitchen, catching the end of our conversation. What's going on? He asked. Your mother thought we deserved an expensive lunch, I replied, the weight of the bag in my hands suddenly feeling heavier. Brian's expression darkened. Mom, we agreed. No more of this. From the hallway, Terry's voice boomed. What harm is a little lunch going to do? You can't expect us to live like hermits forever. I placed the bag on the counter, frustration rising. It's not just about this lunch. It's every unnecessary expense. We've already said we're sticking to a budget. Catherine's demeanor turned icy. If you're going to fuss over a simple meal, perhaps we won't bother next time. Brian pinched the bridge of his nose, exasperated. It's not just about the meal. It's about respecting the household rules. You can't keep undermining us. The argument circled on until at last Terry and Catherine retreated to their room, leaving the untouched, costly lunch on the table. Brian and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement that this had gone too far. I'll call the restaurant, explain the situation, and cancel any future orders made without our approval, I said, picking up the phone. Brian nodded, his resolve firm. I'll talk to them again. This sneaky behavior has to stop. Peace was fleeting. After the unauthorized lunch, Catherine and Terry simmered with barely concealed resentment, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Then, one evening, as I was washing dishes, the calm shattered once more. Brian had just come in from the yard, looking worn, and I was about to ask about his day when a sudden crash from the living room had us both sprinting to investigate. We found Terry looming over a shattered vase, one of the few heirlooms I deeply valued. What just happened? Brian asked, his voice measured despite the scene. It just slipped out of my hand, Terry replied, his tone devoid of apology and edged with defiance. As Brian crouched to gather the broken pieces, I couldn't hold back. That vase was an heirloom from my grandmother. It has more history with this house than any of us. Catherine, leaning in the doorway, dismissed it with a shrug. It's just a vase. You can always find another. That's not the point, Catherine. I shot back, anger rising. This is about respect, something that's clearly lacking here. Terry raised his voice, his frustration boiling over. Respect. How about the way you treat us like second-rate residents in our own home? Brian rose to his feet, facing his father directly. You're here because we allow it, Dad. Don't forget that. It doesn't feel like we're allowed anything, Catherine snapped, her tone sharp. It feels like we're just tolerated. Living with Terry and Catherine was like navigating a minefield. One particular evening pushed me to my limit. We were sitting at the dinner table, the scene of countless past disputes, when Catherine dropped an astonishing new request. Brian, I saw a lovely coat today, and I think we should use Michael's college fund to buy it, she said, as casually as if she were suggesting a change in coffee brands. I choked on my drink, setting my glass down forcefully. Excuse me, what did you just say? With a sweet smile, Catherine mistook my shock for agreement. It's only money, dear. Michael can take out loans for college, and I do need a new coat. Brian, who had been silently fuming, slammed his fork down. Mom, that's not happening. That fund is for our son's future, not for your shopping spree. Catherine's expression soured. How can you deny your mother such a simple thing? It's not simple, and we're not discussing this further, Brian said firmly, bringing the matter to an unmistakable close. My last shred of patience finally broke. Enough, I said firmly, standing up. Terry's voice rose, echoing through the room. You're being unreasonable and cruel. We're your family. His tone turned cold as he added, maybe the local news would like to know how you treat your parents. Imagine what your employers might think. Anger and unease churned within me, but I felt my resolve solidify. This isn't how a family behaves, I replied. You both need to find somewhere else to live. This arrangement isn't working. Catherine started crying, casting herself as the victim, while Terry continued with accusations and thinly veiled threats. The argument ended with them storming off, leaving Brian and me in a heavy silence. Later, after the house had quieted down, I retreated to her bedroom and called my grandmother. She picked up after a few rings, her familiar voice a balm for my nerves. Grandma, it's Sandra, I began, my voice thick with emotion. What's wrong, my dear? She asked, instantly concerned. I told her everything. The constant demands, the threats, and how unbearable life with Catherine and Terry had become. She listened patiently, occasionally murmuring softly, until I finished. I'll come and stay with you for a few months, she decided without hesitation. Are you sure, Grandma? What about the nursing home? I asked. I'm sure, she replied. Sounds like you need me right now. Her arrival brought a much-needed breath of fresh air to her tense home. Although age had slowed her, Grandma's spirit was as resilient as ever. Terry and Catherine's discomfort was obvious, their unease practically palpable. I'll be staying on the ground floor, Grandma announced as she entered, her suitcase trailing behind. We might need to rearrange a few things. Terry barely concealed his irritation behind a forced smile. Of course, we'll make sure you're comfortable, right? He said, glancing at Catherine, who nodded stiffly. Grateful for her support, I finally felt like someone was here to set things right. After the movers adjusted the space to accommodate her, Grandma wasted no time in calling a family meeting. I've heard enough from Sandra about these issues, and I'm not pleased, she began, her tone sharp and direct. Terry started to object, but Grandma silenced him with a raised hand. I'm not finished. Technically, this house is still under my name. I allowed Sandra and Brian to stay here rent-free, but that doesn't extend to you too. Catherine's face went pale. You want us to pay rent? She stammered. Yes, I do. $5,500 a month, Grandma replied evenly. That's outrageous, Terry protested, rising to his feet. Grandma's gaze didn't waver. Considering the expenses you've run up, you could manage it by cutting a few luxuries. Her voice softened slightly, but her words held firm authority. If rent is too steep, you're welcome to find another place to live. Or if you stay, you'll help me daily, moving around, preparing meals, and making sure I take my medications. Catherine's defiant demeanor crumbled. She looked stunned, while Terry seemed caught off guard. Think it over, Grandma concluded, her tone leaving no room for argument. I expect your decision by tomorrow morning. The next day, I walked into the kitchen to find Terry and Catherine packing, boxes piled by the door. Terry glanced up briefly, saying, We've decided to move out. We found a small apartment. It's for the best, Catherine murmured, barely looking at me. The rest of the morning passed in a blur as they packed and moved out. Brian helped out of obligation more than anything else, and soon, our home was finally peaceful again. By mid-afternoon, the rooms they had occupied were silent, the echoes of their departure leaving a lingering sense of relief. Grandma, watching quietly, gave me a knowing smile. Well, that's that, she said with finality. They'll be fine. Sometimes a little hardship is necessary to bring people back down to earth. We later heard that they'd sold most of their possessions to cover their new expenses. Their once lavish lifestyle had been reduced to the basics in a modest apartment. Grandma stayed for another 3 weeks, her presence a comforting anchor. When it was time for her to return to the nursing home, I felt both sadness and gratitude. Thank you for everything, Grandma. I don't know what we would have done without you. She waved me off with a smile. Oh, nonsense. You're stronger than you think. Just remember to stand up for yourselves. No one else will do it for you. Her words filled me with confidence. As I drove back home, the house felt more spacious and calm than it had in ages. That evening, Brian and I sat together on the porch, letting the gentle evening breeze soothe us. Life had thrown its challenges our way, but we'd faced them as a team and come out stronger. And we were ready, whatever the future held. My name is Diana, and there was a time when I believed my life was perfectly in order. I had a successful career as head of marketing, a loving husband named Bob, and a stable, comfortable existence. I was proud to be financially independent, diligently paying off our mortgage with my earnings. Family was central to us. Bob's younger brother, Nathan, and their mother, Judy, were constants in our lives. Their father had passed away some years earlier, making the brothers especially protective of their mom. Watching Bob's devotion to his family only deepened my affection for him. At first, Judy seemed genuinely fond of me. During family gatherings, we'd chat over coffee, and she often asked about my job in marketing. She'd nod with what seemed like genuine respect as she commented on the importance of my work. I cherished her approval, wanting to be a beloved part of Bob's close family circle. In those early years, our marriage was full of joyful family activities. Weekend barbecues, holiday feasts, and spontaneous game nights. I remember one particularly lively Thanksgiving at Judy's house, with laughter filling the air and conversations overlapping. "Pass the gravy, will you?" Bob's uncle would jovially call, and Judy would playfully retort, smiling as she passed the gravy boat. Surrounded by Bob's family, I felt a genuine sense of belonging. But an unsettling undercurrent surfaced during a New Year's Eve gathering at Judy's. While refilling my wine in the kitchen, I overheard her in the living room making a snide remark about what Bob's cousin Lori was wearing. Lori, a single mother, was struggling financially, and Judy's words were cutting. "That dress must have cost all of $10, she scoffed, implying Lori was out of her depth among those more financially secure. My heart sank with embarrassment for Lori. This wasn't the warm, welcoming family I thought I knew. Over time, the teasing that I'd brushed off as harmless revealed itself as something far crueler. Judy regularly huddled with Bob and Nathan, casting judgmental glances at other relatives and friends, whispering and snickering as they shared derisive comments. I felt the sting of this cruelty on Easter Sunday when Judy mocked another relative's new car. "Probably got it from the buy here, pay here lot," she speculated with a smirk. "She'll be paying it off until she's 70. I couldn't hold back. "Hey," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't you think that's a bit much? Janet can probably hear you." The room went silent as Judy looked up at me with thinly veiled disdain. "Well," she replied sarcastically, "looks like we've offended your delicate sensibilities, Diana." Bob and Nathan exchanged uneasy glances. "I just think it's rude," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Why do you always have to put people down?" Judy's smile faded. "If you don't like it, you don't have to listen. Why don't you go sit somewhere else?" Feeling slapped, I turned to Bob, hoping for his support, but he only looked down. "Fine," I said tightly. "I will." After that day, family gatherings became a lonely ordeal. I'd sit by myself, nursing a drink, while Bob stayed glued to his mother's side. Occasionally, he'd send an apologetic glance my way, but he never came to sit with me. One evening, after an especially tense dinner, I felt the weight of this divide settle heavily between us. I couldn't hold back my frustration any longer. "Why don't you ever stand up to her?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. Bob sighed deeply, his hand running through his hair in distress. "She's my mother, Diana. What do you want me to do?" "I want you to tell her she's being mean," I said, my words sharp. "I want you to support me." But he never did. Over time, the tension grew unbearable. I started finding excuses to avoid family events, work emergencies, migraines, anything to escape the icy stares and whispered criticisms. Just when I thought things couldn't get more strained, life threw me a curveball. I found out I was pregnant. I stared at the pregnancy test, two pink lines glaring back at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I called for Bob, my voice trembling. He rushed to the bathroom door, worry written all over his face. Without a word, I handed him the test. His eyes widened in surprise, and he pulled me into an embrace. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe this baby could heal the rift between us. Maybe this new life would bring us closer, restore what we were losing. But the pregnancy was difficult from the start. I was plagued by constant nausea and a constant gnawing fear of miscarriage. My doctor prescribed bed rest, but as the weeks went on, my condition worsened. My eyesight began to deteriorate, another rare, potentially permanent complication. It soon became impossible for me to keep working. I had to quit my job. As I lay there, physically and emotionally drained, I felt more isolated than ever. I needed Bob's support, but he seemed to pull further away. He came home late most nights, claiming work demands or meetings with colleagues. More and more, I fell asleep alone, only waking to the sound of the front door closing late into the night. The day of my C-section arrived, and with my deteriorating eyesight, a natural birth was too risky. As I lay on the cold operating table, fear and excitement mingled in my chest. "Where's Bob?" I'd asked the nurse, my voice shaking. She gave me a sympathetic smile. "Your husband's in the waiting room, dear. He said he'd rather stay there." The surgery went smoothly, and soon, the sound of my son's first cry filled the room. As they placed him on my chest, an overwhelming rush of love took my breath away. But the moment of joy was short-lived. Later, in the recovery room, Bob finally appeared. His face was unreadable, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. "Look, Diana," he said, his tone sharp, "I've got to say something. This whole thing, it's not right." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" His frustration was palpable. Normal women give birth on their own without all this surgery crap. And men, we're not supposed to be here for this. We should be meeting our wives and kids at home, like in the old days. His words hit me like a physical blow. My heart sank as I processed his utter lack of empathy. Bob, the man I thought I knew, seemed so distant, so disconnected from the reality of what we had just gone through. I couldn't hold back any longer, but before I could speak, he cut me off. "Save it. I'm heading home. This place gives me the creeps." The next few weeks blurred into a haze of sleepless nights and endless feedings, with Bob rarely at home. When he was there, he barely helped with the baby. His presence seemed like a shadow, and when he did interact with our son, it was with frustration. One night, as the baby cried, Bob grumbled irritably, "Can't you quiet him down?" I was exhausted, my body still recovering from surgery, but I managed to respond, "I'm trying, Bob. He's teething. It's painful for him." Bob's patience was running thin. "You're always focused on the kid. What about me? What about what I need?" His words hit me like a slap. Here I was barely managing to get any sleep, still healing, trying to juggle everything. And he was upset because our intimacy had dwindled. I didn't know how to respond. As the months went by, Bob's dissatisfaction only deepened. One night, while I rocked our restless 7-month-old, Bob made an abrupt declaration. "You need to start working again." I looked at him stunned. "What about the baby?" "We'll get a nanny," he interrupted. "We can't keep going like this, Diana. We're running out of money." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that our baby needed me, that I wasn't ready to leave him yet, but the finality in Bob's voice left no room for discussion. Reluctantly, I began searching for a job. With my vision still impaired, it was a daunting task, but eventually I found a role at a smaller firm. The salary was much lower than my previous job, but it was something. When I shared the news with Bob, his response was dismissive. "That's all we're paying a nanny for." His frustration was palpable. Tears pricked at my eyes. "I'm doing the best I can, Bob. It's hard with my vision still not fully recovered." He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. And so began a grueling new chapter. Mornings were a rush to get to work, and every day I felt a pang of guilt as I handed my son over to the nanny. My days were a blur of trying to keep up at work with compromised eyesight, then coming home to a husband who resented me and a child who needed me more than ever. Time slipped by in a relentless cycle of work, childcare, and mounting tension. Family gatherings, already strained, grew worse with Judy's behavior. She'd act as the doting grandmother when others were around, but her detachment was always clear. She'd call our son in a sickly sweet tone, "Come to Grandma," But he, sensing her coldness, would cling to me instead. Judy's mood would sour instantly. "What have you been telling him about me?" she'd accuse, venom in her voice. "You're turning my grandson against me." Exhausted, I tried to explain. "He just doesn't know you well, Judy. Maybe if you visited more." She'd cut me off before I could finish. "Don't you dare blame this on me," she'd snap, then storm off to complain to Bob. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, my life took another unexpected turn. I found myself staring at a positive pregnancy test, the two lines unmistakable. Panic gripped me as memories of my first difficult pregnancy flooded back. Was I strong enough to go through this again? I realized I was already well into my first trimester, and the path ahead seemed set. Trembling, I called Bob at work to break the news. His voice was impatient. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," I said, my heart racing. After a long silence, Bob finally replied, "Look, Diana, I'm swamped. We'll talk later. Just keep your job. We can't afford to lose that income." Then he hung up. I sat there, phone still in my hand, feeling more alone than ever. This pregnancy, though challenging in its own way, was easier than the first. My morning sickness was mild and my vision remained stable. With renewed determination, I kept working, focused on supporting my growing family, despite everything that weighed on me. As the months passed and my belly expanded, the emotional gap between Bob and me seemed to stretch wider. He spent more and more time at his mother's house, often coming home late at night. One evening, I struggled to put our toddler to bed, my body aching with discomfort. When Bob walked in, I felt a flicker of hope for some help. "Can you read him a story?" "I'm really tired," I asked. Bob glanced at us, then checked his watch before sighing. "Can't. I promised Mom I'd help her move some furniture. Don't wait up." The door slammed shut behind him, and a tear slid down my cheek. I looked at my son, his trusting eyes filled with innocence, unaware of my sorrow. Then I glanced down at my growing belly, my heart swelling with love for the child I hadn't yet met. As my 7th month of pregnancy approached, Thanksgiving was just around the corner. The house started to fill with guests in the afternoon. My parents arrived early, my mom immediately donning an apron to assist in the kitchen. Friends and family crowded in, their laughter and conversation adding warmth to the house. Just as I was finishing setting the table for dinner, the doorbell rang again. It was Nathan, Bob's younger brother, and he wasn't alone. "Everyone, this is Victoria," Nathan announced, his face lighting up as he introduced his fiancée. The room fell momentarily silent before erupting in congratulations. I forced a smile, trying not to let the flicker of envy I felt show. Bob's face brightened at his brother's happiness, and I couldn't help but notice the contrast to my own growing sense of isolation. Judy arrived shortly after, her eyes widening with appreciation when she saw Victoria. Well, she exclaimed, her voice dripping with enthusiasm, a sight for sore eyes. Throughout dinner, Judy showered Victoria with attention, peppering her with questions and hanging on to her every word. I did my best to focus on being a gracious hostess, but I couldn't help overhearing their conversation. "So, Victoria," Judy said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "Nathan tells me you're a manager at National Bank. How prestigious." Victoria nodded, her discomfort evident. "Yes, I've been there for about 4 years now." Judy beamed. "You must be doing very well for yourself, unlike some people who can only pop out babies and breed poverty," she added, casting a pointed look in my direction. My cheeks burned with humiliation. I felt the sting of her words, but beside me my mother tensed, ready to come to my defense. I gently touched her arm, silently pleading with her to let it go. Judy's voice dripped with false sweetness as she continued. "Victoria here makes $120,000 a month. Now, that's the kind of daughter-in-law I've always dreamed of. Smart, beautiful, successful." Tears welled up in my eyes. I thought about all the years I'd spent working hard to support our family, paying the mortgage, and building the career I was proud of, all of it now seemingly forgotten. "I think we should continue this lovely evening somewhere more suitable," Judy announced, standing up. "Victoria, dear, why don't we all go to that new restaurant downtown? My treat, of course." Before I could process what was happening, Judy, Bob, Nathan, and Victoria were heading for the door. Bob didn't even glance back at me as they left. The remaining guests, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quickly made their excuses and departed, leaving only my parents behind. They offered to help clean up, but I insisted they rest. Finally, alone, I collapsed onto the sofa, tears flowing freely. Time seemed to stand still as I cried, my hand resting gently on my swollen belly. I thought about how my life had spiraled to this point. Dawn was approaching when, 5 days after my emergency C-section, I felt a sudden surge of strength, both physical and emotional. The doctors were impressed with my progress and gave me the green light to leave the hospital. During this time, Bob hadn't called once. Since he left for San Diego, he hadn't asked how I was doing or inquired about our newborn son. It was clear to me now. Our marriage had reached its end. I reached out to my parents asking if the boys and I could stay with them temporarily. They immediately agreed, offering their full support. While staying with them, I had the chance to rest and recuperate as they lovingly doted on my sons. I began researching divorce lawyers and gathering the necessary financial documents. A week after leaving the hospital, Bob finally called. I ignored the first 3 calls, letting them go to voicemail, but eventually answered the 4th. "Where the hell are you?" Bob demanded, his voice a mix of anger and confusion. "Why aren't you at home?" I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm at my parents' house with our sons. I filed for divorce." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line before he scoffed. "Divorce? Are you kidding me? After everything I've done for you?" I felt my anger rise. "What I've done? You mean abandoning me right before I gave birth? Or draining our savings?" "Get over it," he shot back dismissively. "I'll pay you back. No problem. In fact, I don't even want to see you again. You know why? Because I'm going to be rich." He ranted about Nathan's new wife offering him a job at the bank, their plans to start a financial company, and how they were going to be incredibly wealthy. "You never believed in me, Diana. You always shot down my ideas. Well, guess what? I'm free now, and you're just a loser who can't recognize potential when it's right in front of her." The divorce proceedings went surprisingly quickly. Bob didn't contest anything, returned the money he had taken, and agreed to pay alimony. When it came to the house, I had years of mortgage payments logged that proved I had been the primary contributor. The judge awarded me the house without hesitation. The day I moved back in with the boys, the house now officially mine, Bob was there packing up his last belongings. As I entered, holding the baby and with our toddler by my side, he sneered. "Enjoy this dump while you can," he spat. "I'll be in a mansion soon, swimming in cash. You'll see what you missed." He left, and with his departure, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The house suddenly felt bigger, brighter, like it was finally mine again. A year and a half later, life had settled into a new routine. I had returned to work and found a balance between my career and motherhood. Though it wasn't always easy, my boys and I were happy, healthy, and thriving. One ordinary Tuesday, my phone buzzed with a news alert that made my heart stop. The headline read, "Local banker exposed as fraud, leaves family in ruins." The article revealed a shocking scandal. Victoria, Nathan's wife, had been orchestrating an elaborate con. She had convinced Bob, Nathan, and Judy to invest heavily in a non-existent financial company, draining their savings and even mortgaging Judy's house. Victoria had never actually worked at the bank. The office she had shown them was a rented space, a mere facade for her fraud. She vanished with millions, leaving behind nothing but counterfeit documents and shattered dreams. To make things worse, an extra loan had been taken out to cover Nathan and Victoria's extravagant wedding in San Diego, the same event that had prompted Bob to abandon us. As I continued reading, a whirlwind of emotions hit me: shock, confusion, and, I'll admit, a hint of satisfaction. The aftermath was devastating. Unable to repay their debts, they lost everything: home, cars, even personal possessions, taken by creditors. I heard from others that Judy had resorted to working a cashier job just to scrape by enough for a small apartment and basic groceries. Bob and Nathan were in similarly dire straits, their dreams of affluence completely shattered. As I processed the news, a deep sense of relief washed over me. I had divorced Bob just in time, sparing my children and me from the financial ruin that had engulfed my former in-laws. Just when I thought I had moved on, Judy's number flashed on my phone. Despite my better judgment, I answered. Her voice was weak, a stark contrast to her usual commanding tone. "We need your help," she began, her words laced with desperation. "The children need their father and grandmother," she pleaded, emphasizing the importance of family during these hard times. I took a deep breath, memories of past betrayals flooding back. Thanksgiving alone, being abandoned before giving birth, the constant insults. "Family?" I echoed, my voice firm. You were concerned about family when you left me alone, pregnant and in peril. You weren't worried about family when you drained my savings or called me a loser. Judy tried to interject, but I cut her off. I'm sorry for your troubles, Judy, but the choices made by you, Bob, and Nathan are not my burden. My children are my priority, and I will not allow your chaos to disrupt our lives. Please don't contact us again. I hung up and immediately blocked her number, feeling a significant weight lift from my shoulders. It was over, once and for all. When I got married, my mother-in-law had sneered, "I just don't understand why you're still working." Her disdain was unmistakable. A woman's place is at home with her children. Gary, my husband, never once stood up for me. He'd brush off their cruel comments, telling me to ignore them, but their words were like relentless needles, slowly eroding my confidence. With my own mother gone and my marriage deteriorating, my resentment toward Gary grew. He had never truly been there for me, leaving me alone to bear the weight of his family's criticism. I remember being pregnant with Amanda and hearing his parents' thinly veiled disappointment when she was born. "Next time, make sure it's a boy," they said, hardly bothering to mask their dissatisfaction. It hurt deeply to watch my daughter face such blatant favoritism. Now, Gary wanted to use my inheritance to move us closer to his parents, pulling us even further into their toxic world. The idea was infuriating, and I knew I wouldn't let that happen. Sitting alone in the quiet, surrounded by my mother's things, I started forming a plan. I would no longer be a passive observer in my own life. I would fight back, not just for myself, but for my children. Over the next few days, I gathered every document I could find, preparing for the legal battle ahead. My lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Ms. Kathleen, reassured me. "We have a strong case, Denise," she said confidently. The battle lines were drawn. For the sake of my dignity and my children's future, I would stand my ground. Then one evening, while sorting through my mother's belongings, I discovered an old, dusty envelope tucked away in a drawer. Inside was a treasure trove of stock certificates and property deeds, revealing the fortune she had quietly amassed. My hands shook as I grasped the magnitude of her hidden wealth. More than $6 million in assets. I could hardly believe it. She had lived so modestly, but this showed the depth of her sacrifice and foresight. There was a note in her careful handwriting. "Denise, I saved this for a rainy day. I hope it gives you and the kids a better life. Use it wisely." Tears filled my eyes as I felt her love and protection, like a comforting embrace from beyond. The next day, determined to confront Gary, I found him in the living room, flipping idly through a magazine. "Gary, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady. He glanced up, irritation flickering in his eyes. "What is it now, Denise?" This time, I was ready. This time, I wouldn't back down. I held up the envelope, feeling a mix of shock and gratitude as I explained, "I found something my mother left behind. Turns out, she left me stocks and properties worth $6 million. Gary's eyes widened, a flash of greed and shock evident on his face. $6 million? That's incredible," he exclaimed, his tone unnervingly eager. I met his gaze, resolute. "Don't get any ideas, Gary. This money is mine," I said firmly, disgusted by his reaction. This inheritance was a testament to my mother's love and foresight, a gift intended to provide a better life for me and our children. "You won't see a cent of it," I added, watching as his expression darkened. "You can't just keep it all to yourself, Denise. We're married. What's yours is mine," he snapped, his frustration evident. Anger surged within me. "Is that all you care about, Gary? You don't see me or the kids. You only see dollar signs," I accused, realizing how much he had changed. Gary abruptly stood, his face red with fury. "You're being selfish, Denise. I'm thinking about our family's future," he argued. "What family, Gary? The one you're willing to sell off for your own gain?" I shot back. He took a step toward me, fists clenched. "You'll regret this, Denise. I'll make sure of it," he threatened. But I didn't flinch. "Bring it on, Gary. I'm not afraid of you anymore." With that, he stormed out, leaving me to collect my thoughts. I knew this was only the beginning of a bitter struggle, but I was ready to fight for my children, for my mother's legacy, and for myself. The following week was a blur of legal consultations and tense silences at home. Gary's shock had turned to a cold, calculated aggression, like a caged animal, desperate and dangerous. Then one evening, after the kids were asleep, he cornered me in the kitchen, his gaze wild and menacing. "You think you're clever, Denise? Hiding that money from me?" he sneered. My heart pounded, but I held my ground. It's not about being clever, Gary. It's about doing what's right. That money is for me and the kids, not for your selfish fantasies. I'm your husband. I have a right to that money, Gary snarled, slamming his fist on the countertop, making me flinch. His words dripped with venom, but I wasn't about to back down. A right to what, Gary? To a woman who won't be bullied into giving you everything. I shot back, meeting his furious glare. His face contorted with anger. You'll regret this, Denise. I'll make sure you don't get a dime of that money. He spat, his voice thick with menace. But despite the fear his threats stirred, my resolve only hardened. I was determined to protect what my mother had entrusted to me. Is that a threat? I demanded, standing firm as he leaned in close, his breath reeking of bitterness. It's a promise, he hissed. I stepped past him, my heart pounding, but my resolve like steel. We'll see about that. The court will decide, I said, striding away as his venomous words echoed behind me. You're going to end up with nothing, Denise. Nothing. The following day, I received a call from my lawyer. Denise, Gary has filed for divorce. He's claiming half of your inheritance, she informed me. Taking a steadying breath, I replied, let him try. I'll fight him every step of the way. Ms. Kathleen's voice was firm with reassurance. Don't worry, Denise, she said. We have a strong case. Justice will be served. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts turned to my children, sleeping peacefully in their rooms. This battle wasn't just for me, it was for their future. Gary had become a stranger, consumed by greed and resentment, but I was no longer the woman he thought he could intimidate. As I drifted towards sleep, I pictured the courtroom, the judge, and myself standing tall, not just for the inheritance, but for my dignity, my children's future, and the quiet strength my mother had instilled in me. The legal fight was brutal. Gary's tactic was obvious, to paint me as an uncooperative wife hoarding the family's resources. But his arguments were flimsy, rooted in desperation rather than substance. During a mediation session, in a last attempt to reach a settlement before trial, Gary sat across from me, his lawyer by his side. His gaze was cold, his demeanor bordering on arrogant. Let's be reasonable, Denise, his lawyer began smoothly. Gary is entitled to a portion of this inheritance. It's only fair. I glanced at Miss Kathleen, my resolve unwavering. Fair, I replied, my tone firm. Gary has contributed nothing to this inheritance. It was left to me by my late mother, intended solely for me and our children. Gary's claim to my inheritance wasn't just a legal fight, it was a moral one. My mother had worked tirelessly to save this, not for Gary's whims but for the future and security of her grandchildren. This inheritance wasn't just money, it was her legacy. I was prepared to defend it with everything I had. Gary leaned forward, his tone dripping with scorn. Come on, Denise, you're just being spiteful. Don't you think the kids would want their father to have a share? A surge of anger flared within me. This isn't about spite, Gary. It's about justice, I shot back, my voice sharp. You've never once considered what the kids truly need? This is about your greed. His lawyer began to interrupt, but Gary waved him off. You think you can take everything, don't you, Denise? Play the grieving daughter and the victimized wife. I met his glare, my voice calm but resolute. This isn't a game, Gary. You're the one trying to take what isn't yours. The mediator, a stern-faced woman, raised her hands in an attempt to bring order. Let's keep this civil. We're here to find a resolution. Gary cut her off, his voice rising. Resolution? She's the one being unreasonable. The tension in the room was thick and suffocating, but I kept my tone steady. I am being reasonable, Gary. I'm protecting what my mother intended for her grandchildren. Your claims are baseless. Seeing we were at an impasse, the mediator called for a break. As we stood, Gary leaned close, his breath hot against my ear. You'll pay for this, Denise. I'll make sure of it. I walked out of the room, heart pounding, but my resolve solid. His threats were empty, his case weak, and I knew the law was on my side. I was determined to see this fight through to the end. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in legal preparation. Miss Kathleen and I went over every detail, every document, ensuring I was ready for what lay ahead. The children stayed with my sister, shielded from the turmoil. I missed them dearly, but I knew this battle was as much for their future as it was for mine. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Standing in the courtroom, I felt a surge of strength, prepared to defend my mother's legacy. I braced myself, prepared to face Gary and dismantle whatever twisted story he intended to tell. This was the moment of truth, and I was ready to defend my mother's legacy and secure my children's future. I steeled myself, channeling every ounce of strength into the fight ahead. The courtroom became a battleground where words served as weapons. Gary's attorney painted him as a wronged husband unjustly denied his share. But under Miss Kathleen's skillful cross-examination, his arguments crumbled like a fragile house of cards. During a recess, Gary confronted me in the hallway, fury twisting his face. "You're ruining everything, Denise," he snarled. "Do you really think you're going to walk away with all that money?" Despite the fear clawing at my insides, I held my ground. "It's not your money, Gary. It never was." He stepped closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "I'll drive this out as long as it takes. I'll bleed you dry with legal fees." I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Do what you must. I won't let you bully me into submission." As we returned to the courtroom, I felt a surge of empowerment. Gary's threats seemed hollow, his bravado masking desperation. The final verdict brought vindication. The judge ruled in my favor, recognizing the inheritance as solely mine. Gary's expression of defeat was unmistakable. While I'd won the legal battle, it came at the cost of my marriage. The family I once knew had shattered. In the weeks that followed, Gary's life unraveled. His reputation, once built on intimidation, crumbled as people saw him for the greedy man he truly was. Word of his downfall soon reached me. He'd lost his job, his friends distanced themselves, and his standing in the community was in tatters. His fall from grace was sharp, and though I couldn't feel pleased, there was an undeniable sense of poetic justice. One evening, a phone call interrupted my thoughts. It was a mutual friend. "Denise, have you heard the latest about Gary?" I paused. "No, what happened?" "He's leaving town. He lost his job and his house. He's pretty much destitute." A complex emotion stirred within me, not quite satisfaction, but something close. Gary had sown seeds of destruction in his pursuit against me, but ultimately, he was the one who unraveled. After hanging up, I gazed at a picture of my children on the mantel. This fight had been for them, for their future and security. That night, as I tucked them into bed, a deep sense of peace washed over me. The battle was over, and we had come out stronger, free from Gary's shadow, and ready for a new chapter. Life would be different, but we were together, and that was all that mattered. In the months following the court ruling, life found a new rhythm. The victory brought closure, yet it marked the beginning of a new journey of healing and rebuilding. I decided to sell our old house, which held too many bitter memories. Each item I packed was a step further from my past with Gary. I was committed to building a better future for Amanda and Andrew. One day, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I found a photo of Gary and me during happier times. For a moment, I allowed myself to grieve for the life I thought we had, for the love I once believed was real. But as I looked at his face in the photo, I realized that the man I had married no longer existed. He had shown his true colors, dark and unpleasant. With a decisive motion, I tossed the photo into the trash, a symbolic act of letting go. Moving to a new town brought us a fresh start. I found a cozy home in a welcoming neighborhood, and the kids quickly made friends at their new school. I immersed myself in my writing, finding solace in the worlds I created. One evening, as I was tucking Amanda into bed, she looked up at me with her big, innocent eyes and asked, "Mom, do you miss Dad?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes I miss who I thought your dad was," I said softly, "but we're better off now." It was true. Despite everything, we had found a way to move forward, stronger and more united. "We're a strong team, just the three of us," I added, and she nodded with a maturity beyond her years. "I like it here, Mom. I like our new home," she said, her words warming my heart. We had come a long way. As I lay in bed that night, my thoughts turned to Gary's downfall. His greed and malice had backfired, leaving him with nothing. While I took no joy in his misfortune, there was a sense of justice in the outcome. The road ahead for the kids and me would be long, but we were finally on a path to healing. With the inheritance securely invested, I knew it would provide for their education and their future needs. I closed my eyes, thinking of my mother. Her strength and foresight had been our salvation. In her wisdom, she had given me the means to protect myself and my children. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a profound peace. The storm that had once threatened to uproot our lives had passed, leaving clarity and hope in its wake. We had weathered the worst, and now, with a new day dawning, it felt like anything was possible.